Welcome to episode one of Hack Jack's Brain. My guest, you're not hearing me, are you? We're waiting on audio. Still trying to connect to the audio. All right. Well, so while Aaron is doing that, it says you have audio now. Do you hear me?
Okay.
I hear you. You hear
Sorry,
me.
I'm here now.
Okay. So Aaron, you're my first guest on this particular podcast.
Yes, I do.
And
It's a little stuttery.
is it?
Okay.
This is just maddening. This is what happens with Zoom. It just makes me want to, yeah, it'll work or it won't. We'll see. So I met you on Twitter. I asked, you said you were a novelist. I went and looked at your website and was like, oh, it looks like he might write good books because, you know, the covers are really attractive. So that's clearly the sign of a well-written book, right? And I just hate reading bad writing. I hate it with a passion. And so it was with a little bit of fear and trepidation that I began reading Surveillance, the novel you suggested to me. And oh my gosh, was I happy. What a great read. What a well-told, well-conceived story. Characters I actually cared about. It was a legitimate page turner. I started it, I think it was Friday night. It was either Friday night or Saturday night. And I was really frustrated because I got too sleepy to keep reading. I am not kidding. I woke up Sunday morning with my Kindle right next to me. I did not get out of bed. I picked up my Kindle and read to the end. The book was that good. So I want you to welcome Aaron Pogue. That's a ridiculously wordy introduction. Welcome. Glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Gosh, we have got slow responses on this Zoom line. Okay, so tell us a little bit about your what kind of stories you write, and then we're going to get into the real reason I want to talk to you.
Okay. I write science fiction and fantasy. I write high concept stuff a lot. Everything I write is I try to write fantasy adventure. I try to write sci-fi adventure. Like I want the page turners. I was in a master's program, and one of the pieces of feedback I got from my professor was, we usually don't say this to the students, but your pace is like every scene is too interesting. Like you need to have varied pace, and like try to have maybe some chapters where things slow down because it's stressful to read your books sometimes. And I decided to turn that into some marketing material and just stick with it because that's my style. I took the feedback. I try to make sure that the beats move between emotional and action. But what I'm always trying to do is talk about, I'm trying to show the real world by showing a different world. That's always what I'm trying to do, because I think that the real world is so much bigger than we can see it as, because just to kind of get through our days, we have to imagine it's small and plain and obeys rules. And so we spend every day kind of looking at the world as small and ordinary, and we could look at it as lots and lots of other ways, and it would also match that. And so I make fantasy universes because people get really upset when you tell them your life is like this. You could completely change the way you look at your world. So I tell them stories in other universes and just kind of slowly build up over time this understanding that it's not because there's magic in this story I'm telling you, it's because this is how the universe works. This is what the human experience is.
So that is why you and I both dig Terry Pratchett. and I guess to a lesser extent, Neil Gaiman. Um, yes. Okay. Aaron, I want to follow that rabbit down that particular trail. First of all, because it really resonates with me, but we'd probably just be talking with each other about things we both know and believe anyway. And what I, so maybe we'll do that offline, but what I really want to jump into, by the way, I got to say this. Aaron is a fellow Oklahoman. I grew up in Oklahoma. Aaron grew up in Oklahoma. So anytime I run into a literate, interesting Oklahoman, I just feel compelled to connect. So um, that's, I think that's actually the reason why I pinged him online was, you're from Oklahoma. Um, but
That's part of
that,
why I answered too. I feel the same way.
yeah, yeah. Did you grow up in the Oklahoma City area?
I actually grew up around Tulsa, out in the country, outside Claremore.
Oh, that's right.
So
We had
that's up
that
in the north.
conversation. Right. So you were a little south of Tulsa. I was a little north of Tulsa.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
pretty easy. For those of you who don't know, Tulsa is a really cool town. It just is. Um, all right, so let's get down to brass tacks. So on Twitter, you asked this question: "Ask me anything about the Bible that you don't understand." Um, and because I knew you were from Oklahoma, I already slotted you in my head. Um, for those who don't know, growing up, Oklahoma is part of what's called the buckle of the Bible Belt. It is, people who don't go to church are extraordinarily rare in Oklahoma. Talking about God, particularly the Christian God, that's just part of life. So I wanted to hear what you had to say because I grew up in that environment, and it was an integral part of my life for a long time. Um, but I'd read your book, and I thought I found a good mind there, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts. So the question I asked you was, why is the New Testament book of James in the New Testament? It contradicts pretty well everything Paul ever wrote, frankly. I mean, specifically, it contradicts the message of Galatians and the message of Romans. Um, and for those of you who don't care about the Bible or care about Christianity, you don't have to hang up right now, because
Oh, yeah.
this conversation is not going to be about the Bible or Christianity, I'm pretty sure.
It's true.
This is just the jumping off point.
It's the people who are very excited about hearing the Bible talked about in normal ways who should probably get out of here, because I'm not going to talk about any of the normal ways.
Yeah, probably the folks you and I grew up with are probably not interested in this conversation. Everybody else might be. Okay, so without going into the details about the theological details about why the book of James just doesn't belong in the New Testament, answer my question, because I want to recapitulate the answer, and then let's go from there. I loved this answer.
Okay. Okay, the video still, or the audio really, is still cutting out every now and then. So far it's been, but this is going to be a complicated conversation, and so if we have to double back and redo a couple minutes, I'm willing to. So
cool.
I'll let you know if you cut out. You let me know if I cut out.
Okay.
Okay. So my perspective, I mean, my answer, the way you asked it, and my perspective on it is that essentially, I also said there is, I'll do my disclaimer here too, because it's a really important one. Sometimes we don't know what we have ideas and we don't know where traditions came to us. Other times there's a dense historical record about what the arguments were and what the conversation was. And
right.
so there was a council in which they decided the answer to your actual question, which why is James included in the canon when it contradicts.
Yeah, I know all that. I'm not interested in those answers.
I don't know their answers, and the thing I say might contradict them, but I also don't think they were as sovereign in that decision making as they thought they were. So, which gets me back over to James. So, my perspective on it, and this grew a lot just in the last year, is that that the gospel message that Jesus brought, we would probably find in the books of John and James, because Jesus was talking to them for years. Like, they knew what he had to say. And so if there's a contradiction, it seems to me that's probably the new guy who's early on the scene trying to get up to speed with James and John.
Okay.
This is not the way all of Western civilization looks at these books. I mean, we're built on the rationalism that's Paul. I mean, so I see very much why the Catholics, the canon that we have, grew out of Paul taking this mystical message, this very Jewish worldview, and repackaging it in sort of Greek thought, and making it very rational. And I love the books of Paul. I love reading through him talking, taking what I see in the mystical message Jesus had, and then say, how would I characterize this to someone who's not willing to look at things mystically? We've at this point adopted Paul's perspective so much that that's the inverse. Like, it's every now and then, well, hey, let's see what John had to say about this story, even though it's going to be weird. And I kind of feel like that's probably where it started from. And so I took that perspective, and the problem is there's still all the contradictions. And that's the thing I find most interesting in the Bible is looking at these things. I'm looking at exactly the question you asked. Like, these two things I'm like, if any of this, I'm into systems and social construction, and I say, if any of the Bible is to be listened to, the only reason I think that's true is because this Bible says to listen to this Bible, and the people who told me to also said to. And so I get in a position where it's like, I'm very interested in what does all that mean? Like, I can't set aside those parts of the question. I find them fascinating. And so I just believe that if there's a misunderstanding, it's mine. Like, God's not confused. The Bible's either worthwhile or isn't. And I'm way too late into my life to just shift away. It's the language I use to talk about everything else. So from that perspective, like to make any of that work, James actually turns upside down. Like, I guess that's I talked a really long way around it. But my real answer to your question is James is even weirder than it seems. Like, to me, the question should have been John, like the Gospel of John or the book of Revelation. But those are so weird, we can just kind of set them aside as that's a way to talk about things. James seems like it's a rational book.
Oh, yeah.
I think James is James trying to do what Paul did with his entire career. But I think James already is so faithful, he can't look at things the way faithless people look at them.
Okay, so I want to pause right there because we're still a little too inside baseball.
That's true. Yes, I immediately recognize it.
So I want to contextualize what you just said for people who don't know the Bible, don't know James, don't know Revelation, don't know John. you don't have to know any of this for this conversation to be cool. Just suffice it to say that these three little books inside the New Testament are kind of both in tone and theme really not like most of the rest of it, and so not like that if you read them from a enlightenment rationalistic perspective, they literally don't fit with the rest of it. They don't fit. And that was really where my question was coming from when I asked you that. So your answer in Twitter used the words mysticism, mystical, mythical, and sovereignty. And that's the rabbit hole I want to go down. Now, you've already hacked my brain a little bit by saying that that Paul was really the interloper, not James, not John, but Paul. So, as somebody who knows the inside baseball, I'm like, that's a really cool way to look at it. But for those of us, for everybody else who's not inside baseball, let's take it, up one level. Let's abstract it. And I want to go back to what you said about your novels, where you talk about the real world by creating alternate universes because the real world is too big to conceive or to perceive. I guess that's really, so we conceive these smaller, abbreviated and maybe amplified versions of the universe that we actually inhabit in order to make sense of the universe that we actually inhabit. So can you tie all those little pieces together?
Sure, absolutely. My one of the ways I kind of described the cosmology of that for my fantasy novels, my first epic fantasy series.
Which now I got to read.
Oh yeah. That's the modest response. But if you like any of this, you've got to read that series because
I love Surveillance. There's follow-ons to Surveillance, right?
Oh yes, there's 4 books in the series out. I've got a 5th one under development.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
It was, so just very briefly to detour on that one. That was I had my wife was of at the time 10 years, 20 years now. She was a big fan of all of my writing. And also she was a fan of the Cat Who books. I don't know if you remember those, but it was just a long running, kind of lighthearted, cozy mystery series.
Uh-huh.
And she was also a big fan of Law and Order. Again, a very long running episodic series.
Good Lord, yes.
Neither one of those is really my kind of thing, but those were her. Those were things that were interesting into her. So I watched Law and Order with her for a while, and eventually it occurred to me, as a writer, I really ought to read the books she likes too. So I went to check them out, and one of the things that struck me is they are cozy mysteries, but the formula is a really straightforward cozy mystery in a small town with a eligible bachelor as the main character, and it's just church gossip. Like that's what it actually is. It's the whole series. It's just all the different couples who would like to get together, and the murder mystery is just barely there, just an excuse for us to have this story about what's going on between these people.
Which is why women read it, because it's really just this relational interaction, and the mystery is just kind of the skeleton to hang everything else on.
Yeah.
Oh,
God.
and I should write for women. I really should. Well, that would just be better.
Let this come across as too exaggerated. Like there's one of the books, it was 12 or 13 in the series. The author's well settled into how it works. But I was on page 120 of the book, and they're only like 250-page books tops. And then somebody died, and I realized I've been reading this murder mystery. I'm halfway through, and someone just now finally died. First half of the book, we forgot to have a murder. And it wasn't a long, complex setup. They were just talking about other stuff. Oh, a new shop opened. So, and I will, and I mean, I could look at this. I mean, I could describe all this in a really like cynical way, but she loved the books, and they were, I mean, they're bestsellers. They were very popular, and so I looked at it, and what I saw there was the series structure and the making relationship, like getting to know these characters and getting to know a community, and actually you can get belonging. Like it's not, we all know about every now and then you make a connection with a character.
Yeah.
And we kind of like in the fiction we read or the shows we watch, and that's powerful. And it almost feels like a real friendship. And that's a
Oh
thing
yeah.
that we all pay attention to. But I think it was this series that really made me realize you can get community belonging too. You can get to know a place well enough and feel like it's enough a part of you when you're enough a part of it, that it's not just a parasocial relationship, but a para-community, para-communal, I don't know, but a sense of home and belonging. I mean, obviously it's not the real thing, but that's a powerful feeling that draws people. And so it was looking at those structures, like I was looking at those when I decided I wanted to write a novel for her. And that's where Surveillance came from, as I was trying to write something that got at the things she liked, but in ways that are very my own. I mean, nothing she liked was futuristic or technology,
Right.
but that's what I knew, and that's what I was excited about. And so to answer your question about series, absolutely. I've got a spreadsheet with titles for 25 books, and it's structured in 5-book seasons with season arcs and series arcs and character arcs. And yeah,
Well, I tell you, as I'm reading through Surveillance, I'm like, oh, this is a movie.
mm-hmm.
There's like very clearly a 3-act structure, and you just do such awful things to the main character. I was really pissed with you at one point. I want you to know I was really upset that you did what you did to our hero. But spoiler alert, it worked out.
And that's why I did it. I wanted to show off the technology. Also,
by the way, without spoiling anything, when you brought us to the climax, when we're in the middle of it, I'm sitting there reading, I'm thinking, how the hell is he going to get out of this? He's written himself into a corner. This is bad. And then of course the other part of me that's not in the story but is watching myself read the story is thinking, oh, he'll figure it out. Settle down. But inside the story, I'm like, dude, this is so bad. Anyway, I loved it. I loved the story. I know we're not diving into mystery and alternate universes and the mythical and the mysticism of the sovereignty of the creator, but this all came out of your mind. So
that series, I mean, that's as good a place as any to talk about. That series was originally, like, that book was originally called God's Tomorrow, and it was a plural, non-possessive. It was
right.
There's a line in the book that we call them databases today, but we'll call them gods tomorrow.
Yes.
And,
which I thought was kind of, I dug that. It was a really,
so I've kind of told you the elements I was toying with, and I wanted to write a book for my wife, and I was reading Ars Technica every day at work and keeping track of all the cool technology we're developing. And I was actually walking into someplace on my lunch break. I was walking into the restaurant I was going to for lunch, and I said out loud, ordering a pizza would be like praying. Because I'd been toying with this idea of total surveillance, and like if there were just microphones everywhere, that's sort of the universe premise for surveillance. If there's microphones everywhere, they're always listening, they know who you are, and they know what you want. I mean, they know your shopping preferences, you get the kind of stuff Amazon knows. We get to the point where all this obnoxious, intrusive surveillance, all this ad everything the death of privacy, all of a sudden it flips over from they're trying to sell me crap all the time to there are robot servants finding me the things I want. Like I'm just sitting at home and they're going out and they come and say, hey, I found this thing you never would have heard of, but you want it. And
Wow.
obviously that doesn't just work. I mean, I understand why when I describe that, someone who doesn't trust technology and doesn't trust corporations would say, oh no, that won't go that way. And I can talk for hours to defend why I think it will go that way. But what I was getting at, I
Okay.
mean, that's,
All right.
yeah.
You just committed to do another episode, so we will talk about that. But
um, but it's what, I mean, I mentioned this on Twitter today. I see the actual problem that faces humanity as the Tower of Babel. We are constantly on the verge of making a world good enough that we don't need God.
okay, talk more.
And so because that's what I see. I see the thing that we do, the sense in which we are made in the image of God. There's a book that's very popular, the War of Art.
Oh yeah, love it, Stephen Pressfield.
Yeah, and it puts forward this idea that the sense in which artists are made in the image of God is that we are creators.
Yeah.
And humans want to make things, and that's us expressing our creative nature. And I see that. I mean, I see that in the Old Testament stories. I see that in the teachings in the New Testament. And I see that with everybody I know. I see people constantly trying to take a broken world and fix it. I mean, we're all convinced everybody's a wretched sinner. And everybody I know spends all of their time trying to make up for all the wretched sinners and make the world better. And we actually do. We do over and over and over. And so when I look at this, when I look at the Tower of Babel, I see this story that the nations of men got together and said, we will build a tower up to heaven so we can commune with God. And they started and they were doing a great work. And they were working. And the story says God spoke to himself and said, if they keep doing this, they'll succeed. So let's mix up their languages and scatter them so they won't. And I know the orthodox reading of that as this is a severe God making sure people don't rise above their station or something along those lines. But
That seems like a really facile, shallow reading of that story to me.
yeah, and generally the kind of more mature way is to not talk about it. To say, yeah, that's the kind of
Let's
that's the
just
kind of
not talk about that.
mythology. That's the kind of mythology ancient people used to explain how people spread around. Nowadays, we know about migration patterns, and
Right.
that's kind of the mature way to talk about it. But I don't.
That seems even more facile to me.
I mean, and yeah, absolutely. And so there's a line in, I think it's Mark, but one of the Gospels. It's pretty well known, but I think nobody's really thought very hard about what it means, which is not nobody, but Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the next line is, on this depends all of the
All the
law.
law and prophets.
The whole Old Testament, as we think of it, everything taught about God depends, and that depends is like a door hanging. It's the hook on your front door or above your front door, which was very important in a lot of Hebrew culture. And that's the hook that something hangs from. And without it, it would fall and crash to the ground. And so that's like back to what I was saying earlier about contradictions and not ignoring them in scripture, thinking that's the interesting part of scripture. I see Jesus saying, do that. Take this idea that you're supposed to love the God you're reading about on the page with every part of you, even the part of you that loves your neighbor, the part of you that yearns for justice. all the parts of you are supposed to go love that God. And if you can't, you're not reading that story yet. You're not reading that story correctly yet. You haven't found, I guess, I misspoke, but you're not actually reading the story that's there. You're reading the story we tell each other. And so the story I find, so I mean, all of that comes to taking that approach, taking this idea that there is meaning in the Old Testament, in Genesis, in the mythology in Genesis. There's meaning there, and there is a Christian message there. There is a message consistent with our principles in the God of Genesis. And that's not a hugely controversial statement, except nobody applies it. I mean, we don't then go read Genesis that way, and I do. And so because of that, I see this story about people trying to do something creative, trying to connect with God, and God thwarting it. And as an artist, that is the story of my whole life. And the story of everybody agreeing it's the people's fault and the people shouldn't have done that.
Okay, I'm failing to get some connection here. I feel like you're right on the cusp of getting through to me, but I'm not there yet.
Okay.
So here's the pieces that I hear. The Tower of Babel story is a metaphor for how humanity tries to fix things, to approach God. And you said something earlier about your concern. I may not be wording this right, but your concern is that we may succeed, and that phrase, "we'll call them gods tomorrow," is behind that whole, or is the fruit of that whole thought process. And as an artist, as a creator, you wrestle with this problem of creating, but also with the Babel problem. Or is it the same problem? I'm lost.
Okay.
I'm not getting it.
I am shocked I was able to communicate that much. I feel really excited based on the summary.
Well, good.
Yeah.
You know, if you in an engine where if there's a spark, this is old. Back in the days, that a spark plug had this little gap on top of it, and you had to get the gap just right for the spark to leap from the plug to the whatever the other part was. And if it was too far, the spark wouldn't make the leap. And that's where I feel like right now. I feel like the spark, you're shooting that spark, but my brain isn't close enough yet for the energy to flow. So, but it's tantalizingly close.
Okay, I think I can close it by saying some more weird things.
Cool. I dig weird things being said.
Like
by the way,
yeah.
I just want you to know, you're not going to be too far out for me. Okay, feel free to be as loony as you might really be, because I assure you I'm probably loonier. So go on.
Okay, so the extra part I would add is I guess the extra word that's useful is idolatry.
Okay.
I essentially think I've just rewritten all the words. The whole Bible makes sense.
I dig that.
Means something else. It's a really good trick.
I had a priest one time tell me that all the most interesting people in Christian history were heretics. And I thought, he's right. So anyway, go on.
Well, I mean, if you read through the story, if you read any of the stories in the Bible, I was going to say Old Testament because it's got a lot more stories, but there aren't any stories about somebody going out and doing what their preacher told them they were supposed to do and believing what their preacher told them to believe at all. There's
No.
no story that starts with people in a stable religious tradition successfully executing that stable religious tradition. It's
Oh.
schism after schism after schism. Every single famous person in the Old Testament invented a new religion.
Oh, now I've literally never heard anybody say that sentence. I love it. It might be wildly wrong, but I love the sentence.
I, I mean, there's probably ways to define the terms so that it's
Sure.
wrong, but
Sure.
I don't know. I've recently read through the whole Old Testament doing narrative analysis looking for this. And yeah, I mean, the stories are all about. Now, I don't think it's saying the religious practices were bad. I'm saying while people are safely practicing religious practices that affect them culturally and emotionally in the ways God needs to affect people, they just roll along. And then once that gets corrupted, sorry, that's probably my phone.
Oh, good. I've never heard that sound before.
But then
We're losing some
no
signal
more
here.
notifications. Um,
We've
so,
lost video. There you go. Okay. So
okay.
you were saying people engaging in a religious practice in the way that God needs to be engaged with them, and then we had our beep beep. So
Oh, yes.
I
So
got from there.
it's really back to sovereignty. It's the way I read the Old Testament is all about God rescuing people. And I haven't lost the thread of that. I mean, what I see is, I could go, I mean, Noah is becoming incredibly interesting to me in this sense of he might have been like the resolution of, he might have been what do we call it? There's so many names we have. um, no, I'm blanking on it. Sorry. Anyway, he might have been the end, like the culmination of a whole bunch of different religions. Like I'm wondering if all the famous names that this guy lived 1,000 years, and this guy lived 800 years, and this guy lived 600 years. Those might have been teachers and leaders. Like there's lots of ways to read that. Like we can demythologize
Oh,
it, we can
yeah.
mythologize it. Either way, um, Seth had walked with God, and Seth told everybody his story, and then he lived 1,000 years. And Methuselah walked with God and had spoken with God, and he had opinions, and he lived 1,000 years. And eventually it gets to the point where everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. There's all these, and everybody feels evil all the time.
Oh.
So I guess one thing that's important is I think that that line about where, oh, death is your victory, where, oh, death is your sting is really important. And if you think God has failed because someone dies in a story, or God has failed that person, that happens the moment anyone's born. Everybody dies tragically too soon. That's built in. And that's the premise. That's the willful suspension of disbelief. That's the one lie you've got to give them. Right? If your story is God would have to be evil if someone died tragically, then God's evil. There's no story because everybody dies tragically. That's the thing we already know. So I don't look in the Bible for the solution to that.
This
I
is
look at,
awesome.
okay, so what do we do? What do we do in that case? And how can anybody say God is good? Someone who has already taken that for granted. And so that's where I get to the simulation. That's where I get to this idea that, I mean, I think James and John believed this and said it pretty clearly, that there are angels. Okay, I'll get really weird. I think that they think, I'm going to go ahead and pin this on them so far. Eventually I'll learn it myself. But for now, I think that they believe there is a kind of thing that lives forever that's an angel who lives in heaven, in God's providence, loved by God, and eternally safe and secure. And they are incapable, they can't know what it means to be blessed by God, because they have only ever always been blessed by God perfectly. They cannot know what it means. I think there's that one little line, angels long to look into these things. Even
Yeah.
angels long to look into these things. What he's talking about there, I mean, I'm not taking that out of context. This is deep context on what he's talking about there, and folding it into like other letters from him, is what he's talking about there is the mystery of God driving us to live what, and all of us sinning and being out of control of ourselves. Like James points out, we have very little control over all of these things that we will be judged for and that will cast us into hell. So I think that, and I think all of that is mysterious to angels, and they long to look into it. And the offer is, God says to an angel, I can teach you, and then you can come enjoy the fullness of my providence. But to do that, you will have to spend a little while living through the book of Job. I promise you it ends like the book of Job ends, and I am powerful enough to make that happen. But you have to live through the whole book of Job to ever understand what I have, what I'm giving you all the time. Like, you get it no matter what. There is no question. But while you live, things will accumulate to you. There will be experiences that are not divine experiences. And those will attach to you, and you will hate them. You'll hate the way they feel. You'll hate the way they make you feel about yourself, and they will make you believe, I'm going to break the promise. This isn't going to end like the book of Job. This is going to end partway through the book because of what you did. And that's actually what the book of Job says is happening in Job's head. Like, he's going through that. And so, and God says, if you stay with me, it has nothing to do with whether you do good or bad. You're not being punished for your past sins. What you are experiencing right now is the pain of not believing I'm going to keep on treating you like a prodigal son. You're experiencing the pain of your doubt. And the only way for you to lose it is to live through it over and over and over again.
You just hacked my brain.
I think that's the whole Bible message.
I will tell you, the book of Job is literally the only book in the Bible that I feel like is real, which, and strangely enough, it's the oldest and the most clearly a myth. And yet, to me, it's the only one that is just brutally, violently honest about how life really is. And I'll tell you, as an adult, I'd read the book of Job, and when I get to that bit at the end, and I still have passion about this, I'd get to that bit in like chapter 42, where God has just put Job, run him through the wood chipper. And Job has the temerity to say, what did I do? and God comes back and says, who are you to question me? There came a moment where I read that and I went, yeah. I'm not remotely interested in a God like that. I'm just not. And then part of that was being raised in an evangelical Christian background, and insisting on reading the Bible as history, and not just as history, but as history as defined by an Enlightenment mindset. In other words, is this factually true? In the same way that you know, I have a birth certificate that says I was born in Stillwater, Oklahoma in 1961, is a factually accurate report. And so reading the Bible that way to me is literally the least interesting, least enlightening possible way to read it. Because, first of all, I know that history wasn't even invented as a discipline until 1,000 years after half the Old Testament was written, or at least the stories were conceived. So I got through all of that reading the Bible as factual history, objectively factual history, which nobody in those days even had a conception. They didn't think that way.
Right.
And then I stepped back and I began to feel Job rather than comprehend Job. I began to feel it.
Yeah.
And the pathos of that story, the utter genius of that story. And I have on my website books that changed me. And Job is the oldest book in my list. I don't say the Bible, but I do say the book of Job. So
Okay.
I'm not
If
sure
you
what that discursion was all about, but good God, yeah.
if the book of Job means that much to you, sometime read the book of Ruth, but pretend it's called the book of Naomi.
That's a great idea. Okay.
It's the sequel to Job. It's what if you were also nice? What if you weren't just a rich guy going through this? What if you were a poor old lady going through this?
I will do that.
It's a very useful perspective. I find a lot of pairs when I look through the Bible these days. I look at Proverbs as earthly wisdom. I look at Proverbs as a good self-help guide, and then I look at Ecclesiastes as him saying, "Never mind, nobody can do anything."
Now, I definitely see that.
Yeah, even if you do all that, it doesn't work. Like,
Yeah.
yes, that's what you should do. That's wisdom. And
those are all really great ideas. Knock yourself out.
Yeah, Ecclesiastes says wisdom will kill you. You can't do it. Like, it's God or nothing. God or nothing is really what I mean by sovereignty. It's that that God saying to Job, "Who are you to question me?" That's really insulting if you think you're supposed to do work. I mean, if you're supposed to do anything, but if you're just here visiting as a guest, if God's doing all the work and you're just a spectator reading the story, then who are you to judge? And that takes away from you all the burden. I'm getting, there's no. This is the lay your burdens down. I mean, this is making the Old Testament consistent with Jesus. And really, the number one key is to read the story of the fall of man. The actual, just read it, just the names on the page in English and whatever translation we're using, it already tells you everything we're getting wrong in the entire Bible. Because the problem that people faced, the mistake they made, the thing that doomed them was gaining the knowledge of good and evil. Paul talks about slander and judgment. Don't do these things to your brothers. Jesus talks about forgiving. Forgiving blindly is rejecting knowing about good and evil, knowing about mistakes. And not think it's not about mistakes. It's about angel children living in God's presence. I think fairy is what we're supposed to be, and we're just incapable of believing it. We're incapable of believing God would actually love us if we were just happy and did what we wanted. Nobody would love us, certainly not God, if we just did what we wanted. And that is the knowledge of good and evil. Once you know about good and evil, you can't shake that feeling. And salvation is being saved from moralizing and judging and working. And the weird thing, this is the faith part, this is the magic part, the mysticism. I took that approach, that total apathy, nihilistic, except with nihilism with God. Also, the miraculous creator of the universe is operating me like a puppet, and everybody else. So because of that, I take no blame, I take no credit for anything. I like, instead of the devil made me do it, I'm gonna say God made me do it when I do something wrong. God needed me to learn the lesson I would learn from planting my face like that. And God can take the heat. And so and so the weird thing, the magical thing is when I started living my life that way, I got a lot better. I got a lot nicer when I stopped constantly monitoring myself to see if I was being selfish, and I just assumed what I was doing was the best I could do. It wasn't even that I thought I'm going to be good. I'll just have faith that I'll be good. It was I gave up. I hit that point where my pride was broken and I was humiliated, and I said, I can't be better than I am. I'm just going to go be who I am and take the punches. And it made me free, but it made me nice. It gave me more confidence and courage and energy to go do things for other people. And it took away this excuse I carried around that, yeah, I'm nice because I have to be, because I robbed myself of that excuse. It was either I'm doing this because I chose to, because I'm a nice person, because I care about these people, or I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it because I have to. And that didn't make me do less things. It just made me feel better about all of the ones I did.
I gotta say, um, I love how this has turned out so far. I don't feel like there's been a lot of answers. I feel like what you have done is popped a Pandora's box full of questions, wide open, dumped it all over our virtual desks here. And honestly, I there's an artistry to what I feel like has just happened. And I don't want to tie all the loose ends up. I want to let these questions sit there and throb on the desktop. There's an interesting metaphor, huh? I want to continue this conversation, but I think we've reached a really great stopping point.
I
Aaron,
think I agree.
And I want to say it explicitly for those of you watching and listening who don't understand this. There are a whole bunch of open, unanswered, very provocative questions that we did not answer, and we're not answering them intentionally. I'm not pursuing the answer right now because I want to let this percolate in my head. There's some good stuff there. There's some really good stuff. Okay. Real quick, because I want to help you promote your stuff too. How do folks find Aaron Pogue books? Where do they buy them? Tell us what you want us to know about you as a guy who's also got to make money.
Okay. My books are available online pretty much anywhere you want to find them. Amazon's a really popular source, but I've got them on Barnes & Noble and Apple. You can find them by searching for my name. It's Pogue, Pogue, and Aaron is Aaron. In the same way, my website is aaronpogue.com, and my Twitter handle is @AaronPogue. And if you're interested, I mean, if you like the things I'm saying, then I drop them all over Twitter all the time. So follow me on Twitter if you want more of this type of thinking.
Yeah, he's a really good follow, folks. He really is. And I'm eager to read more of the surveillance series or whatever you're calling the series. And now that you've unpacked all this other stuff, I'm eager to get into some of the other things as well. Aaron, it is such a pleasure to meet you. I want to do this again. I'm just going to hold you to a commitment, which you may or may not be aware that you made, to be on another episode. But
no, I think I'd love to.
Very good. Well, thanks for joining me. Folks, these podcasts will be available anywhere you find podcasts are sold. Be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll talk to you next time. I'm Jack Heald. Let's hack Jack's brain. Bye.